Hi, welcome to another episode of Dialogues. Today I am talking to Chris Mason, who's a Cornell geneticist and biophysicist who looks at the application of genetic medicine to the treatment of cancer, but he also works with NASA on the impact of space travel on the human genome. He's just this really big and interesting thinker, and he's got a very big and interesting book out, which is called The Next 500 Years, Engineering Life to Reach New Worlds. And in that, he argues that we have this moral duty to escape not only Earth, but actually ultimately the solar system in order to save our species. And then goes on to argue that in order to do that, we're going to have to genetically engineer ourselves. We're going to need what he calls armor on the inside to survive in these kind of new environments. So he spells out what it means in terms of manipulating the human genome in order to travel further into space. Felt like a really good time for this conversation, given that we're in the midst of a new space era with missions planned to the moon and Mars, and helicopters flying around Mars and so on. And so we go through the why and the when and the how of this 500-year plan, starting with settling Mars. We also talk a bit about a twin study that he's done looking at the genetic impact of space travel, which uses the results from astronaut Scott Kelly, who was up in orbit for a year or more, and comparing that to his twin brother, who also used to be, identical twin brother, used to be an astronaut as well, Mark Kelly, who's now actually a senator from Arizona. We dig a bit into some of the ethics of genetic research, just more generally for the Earthlings right now, and my concerns in particular that could be used to increase the inequalities that we already see. It's probably inevitable that we also have a discussion about the sci-fi series, The Expanse, and what they got right and what they got wrong in that. So it's a very broad-ranging conversation, which I really enjoyed, and I hope you do too. Chris, welcome to Dialogues.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. A pleasure to be here.
Well, congratulations on your book and your fascinating career to date. Really enjoyed digging into your work, and I just want to start by situating you a little bit for people, because I think there's an interesting story from reading Isaac Asimov's Foundation at the age of 15 through to swabbing the handrails of New York subway trains to genetic cures for cancer, to working with NASA on how we might potentially genetically engineer astronauts to send them to Mars and beyond. So just give us sort of the brief version of how that story unfolded, because it's a great story.
Well, thanks. I think you summed it up quite well in terms of some interesting turning points in my career and also my life. So I'm, I started out as an embryo, like we all do, and then started dividing in Wisconsin, in this case in Wisconsin, and born and raised Racine, Wisconsin. I got interested in genetics from a very young age, in particular in about 8th grade, because I was and still am endlessly and pleasantly fascinated, even haunted by the fact that, the molecular recipe for the synthesis of all of our cells is present in that first cell, but we're still to this day learning about all the sort of gears and mechanisms that make that one cell become all cells, that genetic and epigenetic changes where it's not just the DNA, but the controlling of that DNA and its function, the epigenetic states is what that is. It's something we're still learning about every day in my lab now, when I was a kid. But when I first learned that fact, they're like, oh, it's extraordinary that the instructions they're just all there. We just need to better understand them. That's one of the key points of genetics, is just how do you go from that ball of information into a complete organism. And I just love it. I want to know how that happens. In what context does it go wrong? How do we better, understand it, and then even maybe modify it so we could have organisms do different things. Obviously, if you look around Earth, there's so many interesting adaptations that many have noted for thousands of years, including Aristotle and Darwin. But we're finally at the stage where we can genetically map what they are, and maybe even start to think about new ways to learn from them, basically, even use them directly. So, that's just how it started. Yeah.
I mean, that's the interesting thing, is that you don't just look at that incredible instruction manual for life and wonder at it. You went from wondering at it to thinking, I think we might be able to change that a little bit and make it better. And we'll get into some of those applications, both kind of on Earth, but also for future space travel. And it's interesting, depending on when your book came out or when you were making these arguments that you've been making for a while now, how kind of crazy it seemed is very, very contextual. So as we're recording this, there are helicopters flying on Mars, and 5 years ago, your book would have seemed, perhaps a little bit more out there than it does now. But so in that sense, do you feel as if we'll get into the details of your proposals in a minute, but that just this idea of spreading out to Mars and then kind of beyond is seen taken more seriously today than it perhaps would have been even 5-10 years ago?
100%, even 100, beyond 100. Like, it's not just 100% more viewed as essentially relevant or even realistic. It's really orders of magnitude different from where we were at even 5 years ago. Just because it really the ability to do some of the things I described in the book and that we do in our lab has just really catapulted forward at an exponential scale. So, for example, just finding genes has gone up at an exponential pace in the last 20 years. Finding exoplanets, there were no real exoplanets until the 1990s, and then there were only a handful. Now there's thousands, right? So, and many more likely coming. So a lot of the ideas have really were seemingly possible, and also obviously the progress that NASA and other groups have made a lot of these medical realities something actually we can bank on and learn from and plan for future ones. So. Yeah, but I would actually argue I've been saying the same thing since I was about 17. So my scientific goals have really stayed the same since I was a kid. It's just now people take me seriously. But
so the world,
it's really
the world has caught up with you in a way. Yeah. So but you're right. This explosion of kind of interior knowledge of our genes and then exterior knowledge of the universe more brilliant. So the universe within and without, I think, is fascinating. And I'm going to get into some of the substance, particularly of the duty to go, just in a moment. But there's one bit in your book, which congratulations, by the way. It's just a really kind of kaleidoscopic tour through science and space, and I really thoroughly recommend it.
Thanks.
So what I want to do is I want to talk about your book and your kind of plan in 3 different phases, if we can. First is like the why. Why do we need to go beyond the planet, beyond the solar system? Then when. So that's the timing of it. You have a 500-year plan. I want to talk a bit about what's the time scale here for the when, and then part 3 will be how. And then we'll get into some of your ideas about how we could perhaps genetically engineer astronauts and so on. And then if time, and just a little bit on the kind of genetic ethics more generally, just for kind of earthlings like right now, which you also touch on in a very interesting way. So first of all, I do want to start with the why, because I think that's in some ways kind of most interesting to me, and part of the book, the duty. You say that we have a duty to go. You say we have extinction awareness. We're the first to kind of know that we're going to be extinct, and that means that's why we should go. It's very different in field to some of the other. Sometimes people argue that we should go because we're explorers or because we're innately, then it's kind of mystical kind of stuff. Yours is like, no, we have a duty to go. You actually even have a term for it, which is deontogenics. How do I say it? Deontogenics? Yeah. So to say a little bit about what you mean by that and why you think that just because we know extinction's coming, that gives us not just that it would be fun to go, but we must go.
Yeah. So I try to propose in this book essentially a new kind of ethic, which a lot of ethics underscore what are your duties in life. And so, and it's something that's generally very boring for people. You think about, what are my duties when you wake up in the morning, you take a shower. There are things that you don't think of duty and get necessarily excited about. It might be like, it's just something I'm supposed to do. It's like you think of duty to your children, if you have children, duty to country. It could be a duty to your a job. Not necessarily everyone feels that, but you have a sense that there's something you're supposed to be doing, that you are either, essentially this is something that has been ordained through society, or something that you just personally feel. But I argue that there is a duty that's for our species that is unique because we're the only ones that know it, as you just said, that there's this thing called extinction. Of course, all organisms can feel, it seems, some resistance to negative stimuli, like even small E. coli avoids negative stimuli or can even feel pain. You could argue a lot of animals feel suffering that have higher cognitive abilities, so they can even remember their pain. But no species that we know of has this sense of understanding not just death, but extinction, and not even multi-generational death, which some animals even respond to, but at the scale of all species of that type. So all members of that species. So I think what that means is we're the only ones, again, as far as we know. There could be some aliens. That'd be great if they know as well, and we get to that later in the book. But as far as we know, we're the only ones. And as soon as you realize that, it is something that gives a duty, because it's akin to seeing a train coming that would kill 20 people, and if you just stood there and did nothing, we would view that as unethical. We view that as a wrong thing. If you could pull a switch and stop the death of people when you can see it coming directly at you, to do nothing, everyone would argue would be unethical. And I think the same thing is true here essentially of the ethics towards preserving humans and even all other organisms on life. But I go a little bit further than what's just stopping a train crash, right? So that because a train crash again would just kill a few people, it's like that for not just a few people, but for all of us. Because eventually, if we stay on Earth, even if we have world peace forever, eventually the Earth cannot be our final home, just because the sun will run out of fuel eventually and get too large. So we know it's finite. It's a long ways away. It's billions of years.
Yes, we're gonna get to the
so we'll get to the
but hold on, can I just
questions.
Let me just pause. Let me just test that analogy a little bit, because the train analogy, heading for it, that's probably something a bit more equivalent to an asteroid heading for Earth, right? Which we know is going to wipe out humanity, and deciding, even though we could divert the asteroid, not to, right? That's very different to saying there are 20 people, who are just going to die a natural death, right? This does not, and then we can argue about kind of what natural is. So, I mean, in the end, yes, it'll end, but it feels to me a little bit more like, okay, if there's an asteroid coming to Earth, we'd do something about it, because it was imminent, for one thing, about the timing.
Right.
How do you respond to that critique?
Yeah, the critique that while that's true, it's too far away, or that it's that I won't have to worry about it, is the most common response. Like, well, that's
it's part of the natural order of things.
Yeah, so I think what is natural. I think part of the natural order of things is created. If nature and sort of preservation of nature is an ethic that people have, I guess I'd have two responses. One is that if preserving nature is what you want, nature has already created a species that can be aware of extinction. So if you want to preserve that, then you have to preserve humans and anything that might be like them, and even encourage that in other species. And the second is that this would be, in a long enough time span, essentially it's not just one species, it's all species. So, and that analogy is just a few people of one species, but the difference here is not just of type, but also of scale. So it's like not just a few members of species, but all species, and not just, in this one time sort of a threat, it's like a obliteration of all of them. And I think and life might not emerge again, right? So as far as we know, it hasn't. Maybe it's out there somewhere, we'll find it. Life, the argument here is that life itself is unique, and in particular, life that has the capacity to guard other life forms, as far as we know, is completely unique. And I think, I think life is worth preserving. It's one of the few things that counteracts entropy in the universe, that may be in gravity. So it is, to our knowledge, this extraordinarily unique facet that the universe that exists in the universe that may not come again, has only existed here, as far as we know, it has. So I think it's worth preserving just on its uniqueness.
So
alone,
that's partly why you extend it to include other animals as well. This is not just a species, it's not a form of speciesism, as Peter Singer would put it, and I think you might even quote Singer at one point in the book. But there's still this sense of, like, if the analogy is with a kind of human becoming aware of death, right? So it's one of the things that distinguishes us is our awareness of our own death as individuals, and arguably, a lot of faith and ways of dealing with the self-consciousness of our own demise is a part of the human condition. And I think a lot of people would say that the solution is to find ways to make peace with that and to be okay with that rather than fight it. And so if we extend that analogy out then to kind of humanity and other species, the equivalent would be to say, don't fight it. It's a bit, you're a bit like one of these, I'll be unfair, but it's like one of these Silicon Valley types who just can't bear the thought that they're going to die, so they kind of get their brain frozen and get AI uploads or whatever, because the idea of death is so terrifying to them. And you're sort of potentially taking that on a kind of species-wide level and saying, rather than come to terms with our demise in maybe 5 billion years or whatever, we should fight against it.
It's a good question. So, and there, I think I'm very much planning on dying in the relatively near future. So I will be dead for the vast majority of the planets in the book.
Wow, this took a dark turn from yoga. Please, not soon.
It's very, and I've had really heated arguments with people in Silicon Valley. I hate to pick on Silicon Valley, but that seems to be the place where you're most likely to meet people in person who will just tell you to your face, I plan on living forever. They're not kidding. Or people that will tell you, I plan to live 200 years, and they're also not kidding. To all of them, I say, good luck. I hope you do. I don't think you will. I really would love it if you did. I wish that the technology and our knowledge of medicine was really at that scale that we could project that. but I think it's fallacious thinking because it has never happened. Nothing even close to that's happened. And a counter argument there, some people might make as well. But the Wright brothers, people said no one could fly, and then they managed to fly. And I say no, that's not true. Birds were flying all around us, right? So we know flight is possible. And so I think they're saying there's no organism we know that is eternal, except for deities perhaps. But so I think the first thing I'd say is I agree, and I think actually one of the key points of developing as a person is recognizing your mortality and not fighting it but accepting it, because that's actually emancipates you to understand what else can I do for something outside of myself. And so that's actually one of the most liberating senses you can have is your own mortality, at least I would argue. But if you think about it, is we actually can think not just about what can I do for not for myself, but it's the next generation or 5 or 7 or hundreds of generations down the line. My goal is not to prevent, to take the analogy of like, why aren't you just trying to prevent something that's natural? If anything, there's been billions of years of life on this planet. I think and it's the first time evolution can actually direct itself. It's the first time matter can organize in this context. Life is very unique. I argue it would be unnatural to have, as far as we know, this very unique aspect of the universe die off, because there's no guarantee it'll happen again. I think what people consider natural about death is that they know it's coming again. If you ask people, would you be okay with all of life forever being extinguished? I think that's it's different of type. It's not just it's dying because there's more coming. It would be everything dying. And even there, someone could say, well, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with, like, maybe life isn't that special. And so I have a part in the book I even talk about that you have to be matter agnostic towards this capacity. Like this idea to understand what life is. It doesn't have to be carbon-based, doesn't have to be just AI. It could be some other machine. Any entity that has awareness of extinction, I think, has this duty. So I have a whole section towards the end that I say I'm just matter agnostic towards cognition, towards whether it's a machine or it's a meat that's making the thoughts. Any of them have this, I think, ability to understand extinction and then to serve as a guardian. It's basically a new part of ecosystems is the guardian.
So, I mean, you do make the point that it could be AIs that continue it. And actually, I'm probably going to reverse my position of just a few minutes ago, because I think if you said to people, okay, so you come to terms with your own death, how would you then feel if everybody else in the world died the day after you died, right? And I think most people would be uncomfortable with that idea, but it's irrational in some way. So once you're dead, why does it matter? And I think it's because there is this sense of being part of a continuity. And I've always thought that there's this kind of real distinction in mindset between John Maynard Keynes famously said, in the long run, we're all dead. And as someone said about him, only someone without kids could have said that, because he didn't have children. And on the other hand, there's this sort of idea in, I think, certain Native American tribes, which is that every decision you make, you should consider its impact over 7 generations, right? And so I've always thought the kind of 7 generation versus Keynes speaks to this idea of kind of continuity. So maybe actually it is the fact that we are part of an ongoing chain of life that helps us be aware of our own, okay with our own individual death, which would then speak to the fact, well, if that's true, don't we then have a duty, deontological duty to kind of keep that going all the way through?
Yeah, and part of the argument here is it's not, because there's many ethical frameworks that you could kind of hang this idea on, but I propose a new one because the ability to just exist precedes any other ethical or priority framework. Like if you don't exist, you can't have any priorities. And so the genetic duty I refer to, the deontogenic, is that what is the duty of organisms, of DNA in this case, but again, it could be other kinds of matter, but that the genetic duty is that we have, at least as humans, this unique understanding of the frailty of life, its diversity. We're the only ones that currently can protect it, right? Of course, we can destroy it, and we're good at doing that as well, unfortunately. But we're the only ones with the capacity for protection at that scale and at that time frame. And so I think, and that is what's required for anything else that you value or treasure in life, is to just exist. And so I put it before everything else because by definition it has to be.
Existence comes before essence, I think, is something that there's actually a very strongly theological feel to much of your argumentation, actually, but maybe we'll kind of come back to that. But I want to move on to next, like when we must go. So I realize I'm doing this sort of, or probably in the reverse order to how many of your conversations go, but sort of, so like, let's agree with why we must go, leave the planet because it's going to get destroyed at some point. Then there's a kind of when. And so you've got this 500-year plan, and my first thought was, wow, that's a long time. The Chinese government put out a 100-year plan in 2019, and it got lots of attention. It's like, you're like, oh, that's nothing. And I must say, when I started on it, I thought 500 years was really a long time. But I will say that now, having really thought this through, I wonder if it isn't a bit of an unseemly hurry, because you say in the book, you point out that Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars will all be charred to a cinder, right? It's very kind of evocative, and suddenly you're sitting up a bit straighter, reading the book, but in 5 billion years, right? There's actually this joke about a student half asleep in an astronomy class when the professor says, and we'll all be burned in 5 billion years, and the student says, wait, what? He said 5 billion. He said, thank God, I thought you said 5 million.
I said 5. You're right.
And it's like, okay. And actually, so I've done a bit of math here, and it's not my strongest suit, so you might be able to help me out. But on my calculation, the average lifespan of a human is about 2.5 billion seconds. That means that 500 years is the equivalent of about half a second in the average lifespan of a human, right? So you're saying that because I'm going to die in whatever, 80 years, I've got half a second to deal with it. So that's the sort of time scale you're talking about. And so it's actually quite a serious question then, is what's the big hurry? Okay, so yes, at some point, unless we do something bad or an asteroid hits us, or maybe we can talk about that, right? But we've got quite a lot of time to get ready for this. And so, why are you pushing it so hard? Why as quickly as 500 years? Why get to Mars? Why be living on Mars in 2030, 2040, and then Titan, and then it feels like
farther.
It feels like you're in a bit too much of a hurry.
Well, I am, because I think the frailty is evident by the fossil record of the frailty of life. That it could be another asteroid that hits us, and that could be hundreds of years, thousands of years. It could be a decade. We know it's going to be hard for us to survive that. Not impossible, but would be difficult. And so some of the hurry is of the unknown of the universe that, as we've just seen with the recent plague around Earth, essentially. Parts of New York City even lost almost 1% of their population from COVID, for example. So we know, being an organism in this universe can have its rough and tumble stages, whether it's from asteroids or diseases or plagues. But I think the other reason to hurry is, I wouldn't even argue it's hurrying. It's just that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Like, we can solve all the other problems of poverty and other injustices and other challenges sociologically, as well as doing the exploration. Because, I think the reasons are, one, obviously we want to make sure we don't have some other calamity kill us before we get too far. The second is, I think it's not either or. We can do both. We can solve large-scale structural and sociological problems, as well as explore nearby planets. And I think it will learn a lot more by doing, like actually the process of going, if we just had all these models on Earth and we did simulated microgravity, we would never be able to model what we saw, for example, in the Kelly study, what happens actually in the body in space. I think I'm a big proponent of just learning a lot by doing, and that's where you generally, I found in life, you learn the most. It's you can't do it blindly, of course, but going out there, I think we'll learn a lot. And the last thing I'll say is that it's 5 billion years really till the sun has completely eaten up the inner planets. But the Earth will really become pretty uninhabitable in about 1 billion years. So it's really about 1/5 of that time frame, which actually, when I was writing the last chapter of the book, I got a bit anxious, because in my head for years, I had always thought, well, we've got 4.7 or 5 billion years. It's a long time away. But over the course of updating the research, because of the sun's luminescence will get that much brighter, the Earth will just get too hot at that point. It'll be like, for anyone who's worried about climate change, 1 billion years is about the number they should really be afraid of, because no matter what we do to maintain homeostasis of the atmosphere, it's just not going to be possible at that bright of a luminescent sun, probably in about 1 billion years. And so in my own writing, I got this sense of palpable fear, like, oh crap! I just thought I suddenly had one. It was as if
you just lost 4 billion years.
Yes, I did. So it's as if I felt like the pain of all species. Like, oh, I thought we had more time. I actually came downstairs. I finished the book, and I was telling my wife, and I was like, I just thought we had more time, and she said the same thing. She's like, well, it's still a long time, but it's a big difference. So
you're right. I think I'm with you. I'm with your wife on this. If you think about 1 billion years compared to whatever it is, I don't know, the 10,000 years that we've actually amounted to anything, suggests that we've got a bit of a runway. But as you say, there is the possibility of something happening much sooner than that. And so there's sort of, you can hope for the long term, but maybe plan for the short term and get ready. And in any case, we're doing it. I do agree with you that it's a false choice that's very often made between why spend all our money on this rather than something else? I mean, I hate those kind of false choices, right? You're like, well, it's a choice. We can do both. And obviously the Mars thing is happening kind of quite quickly now. And I think, well, potentially quite quickly anyway. It's very interesting. You have this beautiful description of what Mars will be like, though. It speaks a bit to the difference between reading you and other people, which is, for a lot of people, the idea that we're going to have people on Mars pretty soon, maybe even kind of within our lifetimes, is just incredible. And wow, wouldn't that be amazing? That's kind of as far as they go. You have this wonderful description of Mars. You say, going to Mars will be humanity's version of going to college. Leaving the house you grew up in, traveling just out of reach of your parents' ability to instantly help you, testing your limits, boundaries, having some fun, learning a lot, and likely getting into trouble. So this is a great analogy where you think, yeah, Mars is like, and then we've got to kind of move on and so on to other planets too. But nonetheless, that would be, in and of itself, just this kind of huge achievement to have. I mean, a permanent settlement on Mars seems like the stuff of science fiction right now.
Yeah, and it would be. I mean, some people also call it that it's plan B, but I always like to say no. It's plan A actually. Plan A is like it gives you. Plan A is just survival, right? So if you're on two planets, your odds of survival are just much better. So, and I don't want to leave the cradle of humanity of Earth. It is it'll almost certainly be the best planet we'll know to live on for the foreseeable future. So. It's never about having a backup plan or leaving Earth or, exhausting Earth's resources and moving on. It's really about plan A's being in more than one place. Yeah,
Earth is going to continue to have significant benefits for humans. We'll get on to how humans might change compared to any planet, including Mars, for the foreseeable future. But I also kind of wonder about this as a bit of a swerve, but the geopolitics of this kind of future world. So as a bit of a sci-fi fan myself, I spent time like watching and reading The Expanse, for example. So I'd like to I don't think you get into this in the book actually, but the idea of kind of what geopolitics might look like, or maybe it's not geopolitics, it's, I don't know, planopolitics or solar politics, something like that. Because I actually read this and thought, it's almost like you haven't even watched The Expanse, and the kind of war between Mars and Earth, and also why don't you want us to go to the asteroid belt? Because the belters are you ignore the asteroid belt, and so I have lots of questions for you about how it's going to be different to The Expanse.
A great question. So, I mean, the simplest one is I didn't read the books or watch the series until after I'd finished this book. So it's true. I hadn't. But what's interesting is watching that series, which of course I find fascinating and wonderful and love the show and the books, is how, I actually find the show fascinating, but also, in some sense depressing because of how in that show we've managed to have people settlements on Mars and in asteroids. We're exploring the outer planets of the solar system, like extraordinary technological innovation that enables humans to really pop around through the solar system, eventually farther. Although no spoilers for anyone in the book, but that's kind of in page 1. And what ends up happening is that it's just as much infighting and tribalism and paranoia that exists today geopolitically exists at a solar system level in that series. And I find it's probably correct. I actually think, I as much as I would like it for everyone to work together and share methods and tools and humanity to have this kumbaya moment, we've never done it before, right? So why would I think that just because we end up in different spaces that we would? But I do at least have some geopolitical leanings in there. I described that if we do have people on the moon or on Mars, we should plan for, not hope against it, but plan that they will eventually want to and should become autonomous, like as has always happened. Like rather than trying to fight against it and view it as a colonial enterprise, we should enable, democratization, self-governance, very much like UN Charter principles. Because even if we don't do it, it'll happen through blood if it doesn't happen through...
So build in that kind of independence from the outset. Good. Okay, well...
But with independence, might come fighting. So, I think The Expanse, unfortunately, might be right in its view of what might happen in that future.
So you think it's pretty realistic politically. What about the science? Because, there's this whole thing about how they kind of create a new drive and then how Mars works and so on. Did you watch that series as a scientist with kind of quite a knowledge of it, kind of rolling your eyes? Or did you think it's not too bad?
Some of it was really spot on. Actually, in one of the early scenes in books is this idea of gravity torture that becomes outlawed. Is that if you have people who've grown up with very low gravity and you bring them back to Earth and you just torture them by being in gravity, that it became illegal to do so. It was an interesting concept that because your body had adapted to something completely different. If you bring it to Earth, it's completely painful and awful, and then eventually you'll die from it. A really awful, it sounds like, a way to die, frankly. So the fact that it had already been thought about, tried, and then outlawed by the time you get to reading the book and seeing the series is such a cool, a likely progression of one, what would happen to the body when it's developing other places, and second, what might happen legally. But the thing that's missing from that book, and I describe a lot, of course, in my book, is what are the ways you can modify genomes, cells, tissues to give new features? Because the only thing that's missing from the Expanse, I mean, it could be other things. The only thing, at least from my perspective, that was really and well, in some sense it's there, in some sense it's not. But that I think there would be ways to do different adaptations. Like, for example, when they go to really fast sort of sublight travel, they have to have sort of that juice that keeps their body from having a heart attack, and that doesn't always work, as we found out in the last season.
Yeah.
But so there are some threads that show that clearly you need adaptations to survive space flight, landing on different planets, that it's not easy on the body. But I would hope that if it's been thousands of years, that we'll have better tools than just a few like adrenaline pumps and some tissue regeneration. I think it might be better by then, I would hope.
Yeah, they haven't done anything to the genome at that point. They haven't done any of the stuff you talk about. That's a great link to the next, which is the kind of how we go bit, which is we've done the why and we've done the when, which is how. And you have this line where you say, to save life, we will need to engineer it. And you've also said elsewhere we should be building armor on the inside, particularly for astronauts, and kind of engineering ourselves kind of for the future. And some of that's actually based on the work you did. You've mentioned Scott Kelly already, but and on the work that you did there. And there's a great description of the changes. Coach, you should probably if you could just explain a little bit about who Scott is and what that work was, but also kind of specifically on the genomic, in terms of the genome, the genetic. What did we learn that made you think that we should be thinking about this genetics from the kind of Kelly experiments?
Yeah, so some background on that study is there was a really interesting opportunity NASA announced about 6 years ago that said, okay, Scott Kelly's going into space for a year-long mission. By the way, he has an identical twin brother, Mark Kelly, who's actually now Senator Kelly. And we're taking proposals. So people, if you have an idea of studies you should do, send us a proposal. What's interesting is I actually already sent NASA a proposal when I started my lab in 2010 to do genetic and microbiome and epigenetic characterization of astronauts, because it had never been done. And I was just curious. I'm a geneticist. I'm interested in space biology. I thought, well, we should propose it. But then I still have the original letter. They said, well, we don't really have a samples bank that you're proposing, because I wanted sorted different cell populations, like biopsies. They had some urine banked and some blood, but not much. And said, well, we don't even have the tissues you're looking for, but stay tuned. We may have a solicitation coming soon that would be more relevant. And then it came out, and I said, okay, right, I've already got this whole thing written. So it's very easy. A lot of times you submit a grant, you don't know, it might have a few weeks or a month to write it, but I had it all done, so it was really easy to send in. And then we were selected as there were 10 different teams chosen, and my lab was one of the teams at Cornell, which was focusing a lot on the genetics, so the DNA and also the RNA, how the gene's expression changes. So we're looking at what happens to the body, and did basically a genetic report for the astronauts to see, okay, well, what happens before flight, what happens when you're in flight, and then what happens afterward, and tracking them long term. And so what we learned in the study, and this was, a representative work of many teams. There was someone focusing on the eyeballs and looking at what happens. Someone focusing on the vasculature, the heart. One focused just on cognition. So Matthias Bosner at UPenn, just taking cognitive tests in space. So really a complete physiological and molecular portrait of the body. But a lot of it was first done as a big, exploratory exercise, because clearly we don't have a big sample size. We've got two people, one in space, one on Earth. It's great that they're identical twins, but it's not like a giantly statistically powered twin study. But what we lacked in numbers, we made up for in sampling routines. So we did actually hundreds of samples over the course of 2.5 years. So about every 5 to 6 weeks, we did blood, urine, saliva, did stool sampling, did a complete metabolomic profile, look at basically everything we could. So changes in skin microbiome.
This is a both of them. This is a both Kellys simultaneously.
Yeah. And it was actually interesting is for a little while during the study. So the goal of the study was to figure out, okay, what happens when you're in this space for a year? There'd never been a year-long mission for NASA. The Russians had 4 people up there that had gotten at least that long, but there was no molecular data on them at all, and certainly none that we could access at least. So we thought, okay, if we don't know, I like to think if you don't know where to look for a scientific question, because we didn't know what part of the body would be the most impacted by a year in space, any of those things I just listed. So I always think if you don't know where to look for a scientific question, the best place to look is everywhere that you possibly can, because if you don't know where you're going to look for signal, measure all the signals you can, and then analyze the data afterward and say, aha, that's what changed the most. This is what is the most plastic feature of our biology, and these are the ones that we can kind of keep an eye on for future missions. So he went up basically in 2015 for a year, spent a year in space. It was actually a phenomenal year because he'd be tweeting his pictures from space and like, here's what's looking outside my window, and I'd be getting blood samples from space coming into the labs. Like, oh, that's my test subject. He's up there in space tweeting these beautiful pictures. I've done other work with Scott since, which I'll describe shortly. But it was a really fun year. And then he came back, and then we did a follow-up for another basically a year and a half after he came back to Earth. And basically wanted to see what changed. So some things were really striking.
Sorry to interrupt you. How are you getting his blood samples from space?
So we took two kinds of samples. Some where he would draw blood or collect, say, stool samples or saliva samples and put them in the freezer. There's a big freezer on the space station. It's called the Malfi. And then other ones that we get, it was called an ambient blood draw, which NASA has protocols for this. But this was the first time it was used for any of these kind of studies, which was essentially you do a quick blood draw, and they'll often draw blood themselves, but sometimes they've helped. Basically, put the cap on, put it on freezer cold packs to keep it cold. Drop it in the Soyuz capsule, close the hatch, it drops back, lands in Kazakhstan, gets picked up by a helicopter, and then repatriated, which is a verb I had not used until the study, brought back to Houston. So we could actually get samples of blood that were just in space within about 35 hours. But it's a complete end-to-end
That's faster
process.
That's faster than I get my blood test results.
Yeah, exactly.
36 hours, but with help from Soyuz and the Russians.
Oh yes,
Okay.
Yeah.
And what's interesting? I mean,
a lot of help.
I did not know. I'm glad I asked that question now, because I now got this very vivid image of what happened to Scott's blood. So there's lots of fascinating stuff that happens. He gets 0.1 second younger, he gets taller, and all that stuff. The thing I'm kind of really interested in, because I think this gets us then into the case for genetically engineering astronauts for different kind of environments, is what did you see, particularly in terms of the genome, and I guess the microbiome, that made you think just from that year that there was the possibility? I mean, did his DNA change? Did his RNA change?
Yeah, we saw thousands of changes if you look at the genetic level in terms of what genes get turned on or turned off in response to spaceflight. Most of them involved genes that you actually would expect. If you're getting a little bit more radiation, you would expect to need a bit more enzymes and sort of activity in your cells to repair the damage to DNA. So we could see DNA repair systems and networks activated.
And to be clear, he was getting a lot more radiation. Right? He's getting the equivalent of 4 X-rays every day.
Yeah, 4 or 5 chest X-rays every day, basically. So, and that's not, it's still sublethal. Obviously, he made it back, but it is, we try to avoid X-rays, here on Earth. So you don't want to go as much as any more than you need to. So, but it is still within what's called the Van Allen belt. So it's still within kind of the protective magnetosphere of the Earth. So it's higher, but it'll be much worse going to Mars for sure. And we'll probably come back to that. But but we could see the radiation. We could see his immune system also respond. Essentially, a lot of the activity for the immune system learning this entirely new environment, but also a very tight and closed environment. And a lot of genes also just dealing with, we saw some for telomere regulation. So his telomeres got longer in space, which normally is a sign of being young. But it came back down when he got back to Earth. And we could see all of this in the RNA data as well. And so it seems like the stress of spaceflight really, had both, in some sense, stressful response in the body, so inflammation markers and changes where the body looks like, actually in some cases, almost looked like he had some of the signatures of COVID-19 in space because of the inflammation markers, except there it was only a matter of a day or two spiking, whereas for COVID patients, it stays persistent for weeks or months. And we could also see that, something's coming out in his urine. For example, we could see damaged bases of DNA coming out in his urine. You could even see fragments of calcium. So you could actually, he said in his book when he wrote about the year-long mission, that if he didn't work out for a day, he could almost feel like sort of his bone loss occurring, where it just felt like, he really needed to keep the pressure on the bones because, of course, we've evolved under gravity. So our bones are kind of expecting that. And if they don't, they quickly atrophy, as most of us know. And so, but we can see all this in the molecular data. We can see his body changing, adapting, responding. We can see, fragments of broken DNA and damaged DNA coming out in his urine. So we could see all these things, but then it was even more striking when he got back to Earth, is that essentially, after we got all these samples collected, we were tracking him the day he got landed and days after. His ankles swelled up to the size of basketballs, and he really was in a lot of pain. Really almost didn't want to wear clothes because even just the weight of clothing on his skin irritated him, gave his skin a rash because it had been a year since just clothes touched his skin in any normal way with gravity. Mm-hmm. So he almost had to wander around, was thinking about maybe just have to walk around nude for the house, which is, some people do that recreationally. He had to do it for medical purposes.
No judgment.
Yeah, right.
Well,
right.
Certainly not from someone that puts yogurt on themselves. You kind of
that's right. No judgment.
You're not casting judgment. I thought that was all fascinating, and I think that obviously there's this physical aspect to it, and in a way, there's sort of, you talked about the kind of gravity torture in the Expanse before, right? Just kind of moving from one physical environment to the other. I was fascinated to see you can see in the genome, you can actually see in the DNA, and so on, what that means. So in terms of looking forward. Going to Mars, there is this massive radiation spike, as you talk about, outside the magnetosphere. Right? Nothing, I mean, way more than anything that Scott has endured. And so you can build radiation shields, you can try and build all of this stuff, to try and shield. But your point is this armor on the inside is to say, so is there a way we could radiation proof humans by adapting their genetic code? That's basically what would that look like, and how close do you think that kind of change realistically is?
I think it is probably still 30 or 40 or 50 years away to have it be clinically deployed. Certainly also be deployed for astronauts, but there's so many things we can learn before that point and along the way. So the reason I think it's going to take that long is because if you actually do what's called germline genetic editing, we're actually changing all the DNA in the cells, and that means it propagates then to the next generations. That is a really large undertaking for any organisms, but especially humans. Because what if we do it wrong, right? Of course, the hubris behind that is large, but it doesn't obviate its necessity. Is that if we really if we do it right, it could be essentially enable a new kind of liberty. It enables what I describe in the book as planetary or cellular liberty. Like if you do it right, you've enabled someone to live in 2 planets instead of 1, for example. So I think I view it very much along the lines of not just the duty for survival. The duty also underscores a capacity to increase cellular and planetary liberty, which I don't think is a common thought. But I've
never come across the phrase cellular liberty before reading a book. But it's a slightly chilling idea. I will be kind of because of this. The structure we put around this of kind of playing God, playing with nature, kind of etc. But I think, I applaud you for going for it, and you have lots of examples of what cellular liberty could be, kind of liberate us from the DNA and RNA that we've got now. Yeah.
And from disease and from like reproductive limitations, or even the idea of having, I describe a lot of the technology for having, that's been done in mice of 2 females or 2 males having children together. And, the liberty is not just for your own cells, but for cells if you want to have children and how do you, combine cells together in novel ways. But it is, I think, unsettling for most people because they're not used to thinking about like any cell or any gene from any species could be utilized for purposes of survival or recreation or reproduction. So it does put people into a place that is, I think, it seems like it's alien or unusual, but it's actually, as I also describe a lot in the book, in immuno-oncology, it's already routinely utilized. There are hundreds of clinical trials with exquisitely engineered T cells being infused into patients as we speak. That are, dramatically engineered cells that are not at all fantasy or science fiction. They are clinically being deployed. So I think,
if you go for kind of narrowly defined things going, but when you do, at some points I feel like almost you're trying to make us feel uncomfortable. You talk about cellular liberty, but then you say that we could. We'll get to the point where there's seamless mixing and synthesis of genetic networks in easy, accurate, and cheap ways, akin to DJs mixing and making music with a beat sampler. So there's, that's
exactly
right. That's a very different feel to what you just said, which is from a very narrow, specific focus on cancer patients, right? So there's a kind of the expansiveness about your vision. But to come back a little bit to the sense of like genetic engineering, it feels like to go even further than Mars and elsewhere, that would absolutely be necessary. And you give some examples, and you kind of push the envelope right out to, it would be great in low light to be able to improve our sight. And actually you have examples of how we're already doing that. There is actually, as part of my research, this podcast, I attempted to watch a movie called The Titan. I don't know if you've...
Oh, yes.
Right,
yeah.
Which feels like it might be a bit influenced by your work, because they attempt to genetically engineer an astronaut to survive on Titan.
On Titan, yes.
I was
wondered once by someone said, are they stealing your lab's ideas?
Yeah, that's right. I expected to see you in the credits.
Except
it doesn't end very well. in that
It
movie.
ends awfully. Yeah, yeah. It ends, except there is one person apparently living on Titan by the end, but it is not a, yeah, that is not a promising tale, or a
It wasn't
hopeful
good
tale
for
of
your
love.
argument, was it? But
No,
the good news is it was such a terrible movie that nobody's
that's
actually
true.
watched
That's true.
watched
Most,
what. But to go further than say Mars, or and certainly to endure this kind of it. If I read you correctly, is that it'd certainly be a heck of a lot easier if we'd been able to make some genetic modifications, say around radiation or etc., and maybe impossible actually. And this comes back to your point about the expanse: is that you're looking at it and saying it feels very unlikely that we'd be able to do all those things with our existing genetic code.
yeah,
Probably we'd have
that
to
we
have
have
made.
to
Is that
tweak it. I think, yeah, absolutely. So I think we need to at least be open to the idea, because again, I put the time frame of broad implementation out decades, because I think we need that long to really ensure safety and efficacy and have multiple generations. I talk about in the book that we've seen 2 or 3 generations of studies on what happens if you actually truly modify a human genome with exogenous elements, and not just in a lab. Like in our lab we do this, but like in people that are then reproducing, living in the world. It's basically a large scale, multi-generational clinical trial, the likes of which have never been done, but would have to be done in order to actually really successfully and safely deploy these kind of ideas in the genome. The other option is we learn from other genomes and then add their proteins to our cells as therapeutics, which again, we do this all the time. We've learned from what bacteria or fungi fight other bacteria and make antibiotics, and then we use them. So like the idea of using other creatures' adaptations and toolboxes is something we do all the time for cancer therapies, for treating infectious disease, general, like even other therapies that are just grown in cells at scale. So we already use, the panoply of life's adaptations and toolboxes, molecular tools to help us live and avoid disease or cure disease. But now it's just about, we'll keep doing that, but then eventually see what if we could actually safely and successfully have it be just an innate part of the genome, which is, I think, and the reason I think it's a duty is because when you're sending someone to a faraway planet, the options are, okay, I'll send you there, and we have these technologies that we think could protect you and give you that internal armor. But if you decide to not deploy them, you could argue it's unethical because you're putting someone at a higher risk than, say, the treatment might be, or this new idea of a treatment, but the risk of death would be higher. So between weighing those two factors, you say, well, I know it's unusual, but I think the worst risk to you, and thus the unethical action, would be to send you to a new planet with more radiation without any of these adaptations. But
sure. To which one response might be, well, don't send them then.
yeah, right.
And it seems to me that your analogy between life and an individual life, and thinking about extinction awareness, really comes to life here, because we're perhaps getting used to the idea of using genetic medicine to save a life. What you're saying is that we might need to do it to save life, and not just in someone's going to die unless we do this way, but in a kind of much more proactive ways that we're all going to die in the long run unless we do this. And if that means we have to genetically engineer our way to it, it's different. If you think about the ethical decision for the individual astronaut, right, you could have the answer I just gave, which is, well, don't send them, right? No one's making us send people to Titan where or it's already incredibly dangerous, right? So, and if it's for exploration or fun or curiosity, that's one thing, which is, I think, what makes your argument a bit different is by elevating it to a duty, you change the moral calculus in an interesting way.
And I think in an inevitable way. This is like, once you assume that you like humans and you'd like humans to survive, if you like that, and there are some people who don't. There's some people like, I wish all humans were gone. We've been a plague to the planet. We've killed too many species. There are some people who won't be convinced by these arguments because they think humans are just too risky of a species. Like we do too much damage. Like, yes, there's all this music and poetry and love and there's all the benefits of humanity and exploration. But that some people really are misanthropes. They just don't even like humans. I don't know if I'll win them over, but I think on the supposition that humans are good, or at least good enough, that we're worth preserving, it's just a question of time. I think all moral questions become crystal clear through the lens of a billion years. Like it's just, there's only one thing to do. It's not an opinion. It's a cosmological fact. And so if you want humans to survive, you have to eventually go.
And you say to do so to do otherwise is a kind of form of species suicide and something which is kind of interesting way. Let's do one more just to take us to the next level, because there's an interesting section where, and I don't exactly know where in your 500-year plan this is, which is where we have to leave the solar system, because as you say, we're all going to be burnt to a crisp in, I don't know, I thought it was 5 billion, but as you say,
I know. I was terrified. It was only about a bit.
Getting closer all the time.
It suddenly got...
I mean, by the time we end this podcast, I'll be looking out of the window in a concerned way. But assuming we have to go further, right, to escape the solar system, and you talk about these kind of long-range ships, and it's interesting what some of them you say you should put animals in. It becomes a Noah's Ark feel to some of it too.
Yes,
but this idea of multi-gen obviously is big in sci-fi, but multi-generation ships, and you think that that's plausible now, that we could actually think, and ethical in fact, to put people on ships that are going to go for generation after generation. Could take many more than the 7 generations of the Indians. I think you calculate that it would, even on reasonable assumptions, it's going to take 200 generations to get to Alpha Proxima. So whatever. Talk a bit about how you think about those sorts of those ships, and why you think it's feasible to imagine that we could do that now, send people off and basically say to their children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, yep, you're going to live and die on this very small spaceship.
And that's all you've got. And I think it is a bit terrifying to think of, because for most people think, if I was born on a spacecraft and they said, oh, this is where you're going to be for your entire life, and it's only, maybe 50 rooms wide, and that's it. That sounds like a prison more than a quest, right? So I think a lot of people think of that and think, well, that sounds, why would you ever do that? Even if I agree with your deontogenic ethics, and I think you have this duty, I still think it's too mean, for example. So I think it probably was 50 or even 20 years ago that concept was pretty unfathomable. But I think 3 things have made it more possible, and actually not just possible, but even really tractable. The 3 of them, one of them, we didn't even have any good exoplanets to send people to, 20 years ago. We didn't know of any good ones, really. So it's like it was just fantasy at that point. Whereas now, we, at least based on transit data, transiting information in front of the other suns, some decent candidates. And again, in the book, I think we should still study them for another probably 400 years before we send people. But we're getting closer to that. So one, we know planets we could send them to. Second is we have portable medical interventions and technologies where we could actually keep people, I think, alive and safe in a very small space, and wouldn't need an entire larger sociological and medical infrastructure just for keeping them alive and safe. And the third is just entertainment, like the idea of, during the pandemic, a lot of people just watch everything on Netflix and be, not necessarily happy, but at least they can be somewhat satiated. And, if you send people out, and I talk about this in the book, with the totality of all of human culture and experience, they could never watch all of it. It'd be too big, but it would give them ways to have movie nights on this generation craft. They could look at, could have little sports clubs. They could have, cultural clubs, because they'd have everything we've ever indexed of all of human culture and literature and music with them, basically. So at least you give them the best of what we've got to offer. And it wouldn't be one way. There'd still be back and forth exchange on their way. And the fourth thing I'll just comment on is the idea of being stuck on one spaceship and nowhere else to go is already true today. It's the spaceship is just called Earth, right? So we can't go to another planet right now. We have zero planetary liberty as a species right now. We're only here. And so, it's just a question of scale, not of
yeah, but
we are on.
True.
It's a bigger scale.
It's quite a big one. But yeah, I take a point. Plus, also, I think if that's all if all you knew,
all you've known, yeah,
then I think to some extent you look at this through the lens of our own perspective, and that seems horrible. But if that's literally all you ever knew. And I think that I'm trying to think whichever, because so much of your work, of course, kind of reminds people of sci-fi. There is, there are like Battlestar Galactica maybe, or others where, those multi-gener, ships are kind of in there. But I want to come back down to Earth now, just as we come towards the end here, to talk a bit about the ethics around the use of genetic interventions now, or in the shorter term, for nothing to do with astronauts or space, but just to kind of deal with some of the existing issues that we have. And I worry a lot about how that will work in practice. You grapple at length with this, and I think very fairly, in the book, and you talk about the pros and cons of the ethics of this. And I know that you've actually been professionally involved with some of the discussions around the ethics of that. So I'd love to talk a bit about that, but specifically the thing that concerns me is what it will do for kind of class gaps or inequalities. And I think you may kind of touch on this. I've just finished Kazuo Ishiguro's new novel, Clara and the Sun. And although he doesn't explain exactly how, most of the kids are lifted quote unquote lifted, and it's some sort of genetic procedure that they go through which improves their cognitive function. They're the only ones that get into college. So there are lifted kids and unlifted kids, right? And all parents have to decide whether they're going to lift them or not. And if you take that idea of lifting as in some way making you smarter or healthier or kind of whatever, it's impossible to imagine, in particular, upper middle class American parents won't be lifting their kids, altering their kids' genetic code in utero or whatever, so that they'll be kind of smarter, and they'll be the ones who can afford it. Everyone else won't be able to afford it. It'll just make the existing divides even worse. So that, I know it's a long way from the way it's being used now, but how do you think about the ethical deployment of these kinds of technologies, both in defeating disease, but also when we get to the upsides and how it can enhance us when it becomes a performance issue? How do we guard against it just entrenching inequality?
Yeah, it's a big danger. I mean, but that's true with any technology, and frankly, every technology that's ever improved human health, or the ability to have, you could even argue like locomotive liberty, the ability to like buy a car and drive anywhere you want, or just afford a ticket to get on a train, or even to get on a ship when it was hundreds of years ago. There's always been, unfortunately, a really clear stratification of whenever there's a new technology or a new enablement. There's stratification hierarchies that have really, I think, perpetuated racism, perpetuated inequality, poverty. And I'm hopeful that I think sociologically we're learning about that, and people are becoming more aware of how they deploy, medical devices, medical tools, technologies. Some of them, because some of this is just a consequence that the medical infrastructure we have is tied into capitalism, right? So some things will be more expensive, and then only people that have the additional funds will buy them because they're the only ones that can. And so, the tactical deployment of technologies, I think I want to separate from the ethical, use of them. Is that, ideally, ethically, we would have them be perfectly deployed and accessible to everyone. And that's true in some countries where they have a real centralized health system. But even in there, they have their own issues, right? So I think, in a perfect world, the best technology would be available for anyone who needs it with any medical requirement. But to do that, we just need to restructure a bit of how the medical capitalistic infrastructure works, at least in the U.S. And that's, it's not quite there yet. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of it's very piecemeal. So I think unfortunately what you propose will probably happen. Say if you have these lifting technologies or cognitive improvements. I wish it wouldn't be true, but it'll probably end up,
because there is a difference between the sort of locomotive liberty you just talked about, which is that it doesn't make you a different kind of person, doesn't make you a better or smarter person on the inside. Although I'm saying that and thinking, of course, all the educational advantages and travel advantages and stimulation advantages that kind of my kids get actually is improving their cognition. And
it's
so
kind of an advantage.
It's so I'm not doing anything to their genetic code directly, but actually it's interesting. Michael Young wrote the book on meritocracy. He actually invented the term meritocracy, and was fearful of it. And his son, Toby Young, wrote an article about this coming ability to genetically enhance our kids in utero, and his proposal was that rich people should be banned from being able to use it, and that only poorer people should be allowed to, because that would then improve intergenerational mobility. So we should actually flip it and say, actually, no, your kids are going to be fine anyway, and so we're only going to make genetic enhancement available to those who are currently the most disadvantaged, because it's coming anyway. So
it's a way to address a historic inequality. Yeah, it's interesting.
Deploy it specifically against the way it would normally kind of be deployed. So we've ended up somehow or other we ended up in healthcare reform, which is definitely not where I thought because we've definitely done interplanetary, we've done Mars, we've covered a huge amount of ground, and ended up with some of the kind of political economy. But congratulations again on the book. Just fascinating tour of biochemistry and interplanetary physics. I mean, it's just kaleidoscopic, as I said kind of earlier in your breadth, and it really just, the inside of your mind must be an incredible place to be, given the different things you're thinking about all the time, Chris. So I really want to
places, but just
yeah. But anyway, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, it was a pleasure, and thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to Dialogues. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you did, please take a moment to follow, like, rate, and share the podcast in all the usual places. And send me your thoughts and ideas, including for future guests, to dialogspod@gmail.com. That's dialogspod@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.